in Shankill Baptist. It's doubly nice to be here, particularly because a couple of months ago we weren't sure if we would be having any meetings during our time here. And if anything, I don't know if you feel this, but if anything, I feel that this time that we've passed, it brings a new appreciation of Christian fellowship. Perhaps we've got to a point where we kind of take it for granted, and well, if I miss a Sunday, no big deal, and so on. And there's something very special about God's people meeting together. And I say it's also nice to see a good crowd out on this lovely Northern Ireland summer day. I thought earlier on, I don't know what it was like in Belfast. I came up from near Moira, and earlier on today I thought I would have to come by canoe because we had some very heavy rain. But it's lovely to be here. I'm aware most of you don't know me. Andrew Elliott is my name. I grew up in Antrim. In the late 70s and into the 80s, my father was pastor of Antrim Baptist. In 86 we moved away to Scotland. My parents still live in Scotland. I've been sort of around the world and back several times, so I've actually not properly lived here for the best part of sort of probably about 26, 27 years. We've been the last 21 years we've been living in Algeciras in Spain. 6 years we worked with Operation Mobilization. And then the last 14 years working with Baptist missions in Spain with a local Spanish church, and which I'll tell you about in a minute. My wife is from Rio de Janeiro, a wonderful city in Brazil. We met on the mission field, and we have two daughters, both born in Spain, and that's about where the similarities end. We have one daughter, Rebecca, who is now 19, and actually last Sunday just flew out to join OM ship Logos Hope. Again, for a while we weren't sure if that was going to be possible. She's currently quarantining in the Bahamas, and I haven't met one single person that feels sorry for her. And she's with a group. There's a group of about 11 of them have come from 2 or 3 different European countries. They're quarantining together and hopefully joining the ministry. Some of you will be familiar with the ship ministry, obviously of visiting ports and activities with churches. They're limited in what they can do, but actually over the next couple of months they'll be working in some of the islands that were badly affected by hurricane last year, and doing some relief and sort of building work and helping into communities, and hopefully next year a little bit more normal ministry. My second daughter Natalie, she's 15 going on 27. She, of all of us, she's the one who says she's Spanish. She's constantly arguing with me and says, why do I have to have a British passport? I'm Spanish. I says, well, you have a British passport because I'm British. And she fights that, but does very well. It's been a real joy for us as parents to see both Natalie and Rebecca growing in the Lord. Natalie last year was baptized, has a real enthusiasm together with some of her friends, very involved in evangelism, and not just that, oh, I have to do this because my parents are missionaries attitude, but really desiring to grow and to learn. And we don't take that for granted. I'm sure we all know families of people in ministry, whether it's missionaries or pastors, who that's not been the case, and we don't take that for granted, and are very grateful to God. But I do mention that. I usually mention this at the end, but as we're a little bit different today with the dynamic, I'm afraid we don't have the photos. But always encourage people to ask, when you remember the work and so on, also pray for families and the challenges often of raising daughters on the mission field. Rebecca, in contrast, she feels very much at home over here. She came over 3 years ago, did her A-levels in Dungannon, and she feels very much sort of British or Northern Irish or Scottish or Brazilian or Spanish. She chops and changes a lot, but that's our family. We'd value prayers as well for Rosalia, particularly in this time of a global pandemic, and we're constantly reminded how this pandemic is not just affecting Britain, it's affecting everywhere. And I'll talk a little bit about Spain afterwards, but obviously, you know, probably from the news, Brazil has been very badly hit. Rosalia had in the early days her brother, and she had a cousin who caught the virus. She's also, in the interim, lost an aunt, indirectly, not directly because of COVID-19, but because she didn't get medical treatment that she needed. She died of pneumonia. Another cousin who's been very badly affected. And also very concerned because her father is basically bedridden now, just waiting to be called home. He is a believer, and there's a lot of comfort in that. But very conscious at these times that if anything happens, she wouldn't be able to get home. And perhaps those issues of distance are just multiplied at this time. So do value prayers for her as well, and for us as a family. Well, as you know, we've been living and working in Spain. We're actually in the town of Algeciras. If any of you know it, it's the main port where ferries go to North Africa. So we're actually right down the streets of Gibraltar. We are very privileged. From our balcony, from our window, we can see across to Morocco on a clear day. And we can also see Gibraltar, just through a gap in the building. So as somebody once said to me, it's not often you can see 3 countries from your balcony. It is a port city. It's not a particularly tourist city. You're recording this. Hope this doesn't get too far. But I often describe Algeciras as the Spanish Larne. Right? Nobody ever wants to go there just for going there. You go there to go somewhere else, catch a boat and get out. Well, that's us, right at the bottom of Spain. But I mention that because it is an important crossroads of civilizations. Just to give you an idea, Algeciras is a town of about 110,000 people. We have 4.5 million people go through the port every year. And the vast majority of them are North Africans, Muslim background, who live and work in Europe and return home in summer times. And so you can imagine just the great opportunities for ministry and for reaching out to this people group that is very unreached with the gospel. I'll not say too much more about that, but it is just to give you an awareness of our area. I know that the church has a history with Spain, particularly with Laura Sandlin, who I believe is or was a member of the church here. I don't know Laura well, but we did sort of coincide in some conferences. She was at the other end of Spain, up near Barcelona, when I knew her. So you'll know something of the country. It just struck me again as the song that was being played at the beginning, People Need the Lord. We're not here creating a competition as if one area is more important than another. It is not that at all. But today in Spain, there's 45 million people who still need the Lord. We know Spain is a tourist destination. Those of you who are interested in football will know of Real Madrid and Barcelona. Even if you live there, you would think they're the only 2 teams that exist in Spain. There is a league, but obviously with big money, and it's almost takes on religious sort of fervor, food and holidays and sun, and yet the reality of Spain today is still just such an incredibly needy country. Still less than 1% of the population would be evangelical Christians. There are literally hundreds upon hundreds of towns and villages with no Christian witness. Some of the statistics I have, they may be a few years old, but I don't think have radically changed in the last 5 years. But there's an organisation that's linked with Billy Graham Crusade, and they collate a lot of information about where churches are. And they estimate that today still there's about 10 million people across Spain live in towns or villages, sort of out with the reach of the gospel. Their definition of that is no church within 5 kilometres. So to give you an example, where we live in the Gibraltar Bay area, there's a next town beside us, beside Algeciras, called Los Barrios. It doesn't actually have a church or an established church in the town. There are believers in the town who attend church in Algeciras or in La Línea and the other towns, which are just a couple of kilometres away. But again, if you just imagine that, I'm not very good in Northern Ireland comparison, but if you think of a town of 22,000 people, maybe somewhere like Coleraine, roughly the same size, and there's no church in that town. Huge challenges in the nation of Spain. So I want to mention to you again, if any of you ever receive Baptist Mission's prayer news, and can I say, if you don't, I would really encourage you to get that. I think it's a fantastic tool. It's not a sort of 5-page prayer letter and you think, I don't have time for that. I know sometimes you can get overloaded, but just each week you get a few prayer points from the missionary family in different parts of the world, and I think it's a fantastic tool. If any of you ever get that and have read some of our entries over the years, we'll have told you about a town called Medina Sidonia. And again, I want to mention Medina Sidonia tonight. It's about 70 kilometres, roughly about 45 miles from Algeciras. A number of years ago, we began sort of visiting the town as a church. We've had summer teams that we've done activities in the town. we now have, there's a couple who came out to work with us 2 years ago, originally from Bangor. They've been living in the town. They're a retired couple. We don't identify them publicly because they've previously worked in the Arab world. But they've been living in the town and seeking to witness out there. And I often give the example, and it's not to make people jealous, but I'll very often go up and have a coffee with them. And it strikes me that sitting in a coffee shop, maybe over half an hour having a coffee, that they will often greet 5 or 6 people just in the time we're there. So it's just, they're getting in, they're getting to know people, they're known, people know who they are. And other times when we've done evangelism as a church, we've actually met people, oh yeah, I know this couple here, from Northern Ireland. But the reason I say that is again to highlight the challenges. If we're going to reach these times with the gospel, a quick summer campaign is not enough. And it's great that teams can come in the summer, and over the summers we've done different activities. We've distributed quite a bit of literature. We've had contact with people. But the real need is for people who can live in these times, establish a witness over a time, see a church planted. Medina Sidonia is 14,000 people. It's in an area with 5 times the combined population of 50,000 people. If I drive from Algeciras to Medina Sidonia, it's a 70-kilometre drive. I do not pass one church on the way up there. And in that area of 50,000 people, there's no evangelical churches. It took me about 40 minutes to get here today from Moira. I didn't count. Probably should have tried, but I guess I probably would have lost count of the number of churches I passed to get here. Again, we don't say this to say, oh, the needs in great, there's no needs here. Of course there's needs here. But if you take one thing away tonight, I would actually take away just a renewed desire just to pray generally for the nation of Spain. And these hundreds of times, if there were just 1 or 2 times, we'd say, well, we could maybe send 2 or 3 couples and reach these times, but there are literally hundreds right across Spain with no gospel witness. That's a tragedy. That's a tragedy in modern Europe, with all our supposed facility for communication and technology and so on. Although I have a reserved opinion on the use of technology. I think it's great. I think we need to learn to use it, as we've all been learning over the past months. But Jesus said to his church, go. And I believe if the world is going to be reached with the gospel, it demands a physical presence of God's people in these times. Because the Holy Spirit does not indwell a radio or the internet, he dwells his children. And so we really ask you to pray. I've been saying it around the churches. I hope I'm not going to get into trouble with Mervyn. But I've been asking the churches this time very specifically pray that maybe over the next 2 years, 1 or 2 years, we could see at least 1, if not 2 couples raised up, 3 Baptist missions, to come out and form a team in this time, to really see the work and much of the groundwork that's been done, to see that built on, to be able to see a community of believers in the town of Medina Sidonia and round about. Medina Sidonia itself, if you Google it at home and you get some pictures, it's built on a hill. It's always been a religious centre in our area, in the province of Cadiz. So there's evidence back to the times of the Romans, the pagan altars in the time. Certainly in the time of the Muslims, they were in the southern region for 800 years. They dominated the southern region of Spain. There was a mosque in the time. Today there's a Roman Catholic church built on top of the hill. And our prayer is that not just we see a church planted in Medina Sidonia, but we see a church planted that will plant churches in the areas round about. So really value your prayers for this area and for the outreach there. And as I say, remembering the backdrop of that repeated right across Spain. So value your prayers for the town of Medina Sidonia. Last autumn, we had a team come from Brazil. We had a group of 8 young people. They spent 2 months with us and doing evangelism in Algeciras, in Medina Sidonia and some of the other areas around about us. I mention this for 2 reasons. One, when I was preparing last week, I was just touching up some of the slide presentation and the photos. it kind of provoked a little bit of nostalgia because it made me realize that was the last time we did sort of outreach events, like sort of in the street. Obviously we had planned several different things for the summer, or for the spring and the summer, which have all been shelved. So, but it just reminded us, one, of the great opportunities. Even though Spain is a hard land, even though when we first started going to Medina Sidonia, some of the older believers in Algeciras would say, oh, these times are so hard, oh, they don't want to hear the gospel. And nobody wants to hear the gospel in a sense. It's not native in them. But actually over the years we've seen a growing openness, growing opportunities, and often with a bit of creativity. This group were very, they were trained in sort of, particularly they did like circus acts, and just sort of, it was an opportunity to meet families. So great opportunities. The second thing I loved about having this team is it reminded me what in our mind were traditional mission fields. And Northern Ireland has a long history, particularly in South America. The first time that I met my now wife, she wasn't my wife then, although there was a very quick early desire on my part, but that's another story. But she asked me where I was from. I said, well, I'm from Northern Ireland. She said, where about? And I said, well, a little town you'll never have heard of it. It's called Antrim. And she said, yeah, I've heard of Antrim. And I'm like, you must be thinking of County Antrim. No, the town of Antrim. And it turns out the first foreigner that she ever knew as a little girl was a missionary from Antrim. And when we were there, the first time we spent a few months there, just after we were married, almost every pastor that I met knew a missionary from Northern Ireland. It was quite incredible. Encouraging in many ways, but it's even more encouraging now to see these nations that were missionary receiving countries are now becoming missionary sending countries. And to see this group of young folk from Brazil coming over to Spain, it's a great reminder that God's people are never, what's the word? Sometimes my English fails me. They never stop. There's always movement. And as God sort of works in different lands, he raises people up to go. So it was a real joy to see folk come from Brazil. And as we've seen workers come from other parts of Latin America, that's a real joy as well. The third thing which I loved about this team was to see how they invested in the young people from the church. Again, I had a couple of pictures of my daughter learning to fly, sort of doing acrobatics and so on. But it was great to see the young folk from the church going out with the team, taking part in the public places in the main square in Algeciras and the Medina Sidonia, and being a part of that. And not just while the team was there, but actually then taking the initiative to keep that going. And they themselves put together a program for the kids at Christmas. And again, we're practicing for the spring to do some evangelism in Medina Sidonia. That hasn't happened yet. But again, I mentioned it, we've in the church in Algeciras, we have a great group of young people, sort of teenagers. We don't have many young adults, sort of 20-somethings. One of the challenges we often face is Algeciras is not a university town. So we've had, over our years, a constant stream of young people coming through the church, get to 18, 19, go off to university, and the vast majority don't return, mainly because there's no work for them in our area, quite a deprived area. But at the minute, there's a great group of teenagers. And I just, again, value prayer for them, even as I mentioned Natalie before, value prayers for her, but also her group of friends. And there's probably a group of maybe about 8 or 10 sort of teenagers in the church who are very much part of the church, and maybe a few others sort of on the fringes. But again, just the great challenges of living out a Christian life in Spain. Again, to give you an example, when Rebecca came to study she studied at Royal School Dungannon, and the first weekend or on the Friday, she was invited along to the Scripture Union group, and she said when she walked in, she just started to cry. It was so overwhelming. She said there must have been about 50 kids there, and I think that was just the seniors. Natalie is in a school of 700, probably slightly bigger than Royal School Dungannon. She has the opportunity through her classes to do, as part of her RE classes, to do evangelical religion. There's a teacher who goes in to teach them. 3 children in the school take those classes. 3 out of 700. So again, the huge challenge, and particularly, I think this is such a difficult time to be a teenager or a young person. They are just and this is not a Spanish thing, this is everywhere. They are bombarded with things that 20, 30 years ago we wouldn't even thought imaginable. And we need to pray for our young people. Pray that the Lord will guard them, but not just in a defensive action, but really equip them and enable them to reach out and to share their faith in an environment that is so hostile to the gospel. Rosalia, I think it was last year, a year and a half ago, asked Natalie one day and said, how many kids in your class believe in God? Like, not have a personal faith, just generally believe that there is a God. This is a class with people who would be confessing Roman Catholics. There are people who are Muslims, Muslim background. There's quite a variety in the class. She thought a minute and said, just me. So whatever their official position is in the background, the actual belief, particularly in the younger generations, is very secular mindset. And I actually think the biggest challenge to the gospel today in Spain is secularism. A lot of similarities with Southern Ireland, for those of you who are familiar with the setting there, maybe a past with a religious majority, but it's become very secular mindset, and just no room for God, no need for God, no interest in God, don't want to know. And that's the reaction we get from young people. So do value prayers for the young people in the church as they seek to live out a life for the Lord. So I'm a little bit disjointed today because I've sort of fallen. I'd like to mention, because I think folk are interested, of course, as we said earlier on, the COVID-19 pandemic has affected everywhere, and you'll be very well aware that Spain was one of the early hotspots in Europe. In early March, we basically went within a week of sort of the government declaring, this is not a problem in Spain, everything's under control, what's happened in Italy will never happen here, no problem, no issue, la-di-da. Within about a week to total lockdown. I don't know if they were just lying or deceived, quite honestly, and there's different opinions on that. I'll leave that to the political commentators in Spain. But the reality is we went very quickly into a total lockdown, and very severe lockdown. We live in an eighth-story apartment or flat, which is great when you want a view of Northern Africa, but it's terrible when you're not allowed out. So no garden. We were not allowed out to exercise. We were only allowed out for essential shopping, and only one person. So I tended to go out because you weren't even allowed two people in a car. And so for probably about 2.5 months, we were in total lockdown. And you can imagine the effects on that, on us, ourselves, two girls in the flat. The effects on the church, like so many places, we immediately went to having meetings in Zoom, which was good to a point. We felt very much for particularly older folks in the congregation who do not have internet access, so it's a very stressful time for a lot of people. And again, this is not unique to Spain, but again, as I'm sure many of you will have experienced, I think the stresses and the toll that this has taken on society, I think there's a lot that's still to come out from this, from people who have not been able to grieve properly, and not just loved ones who've died of the virus, but in Spain, there's very much a culture. If somebody dies, they're buried the next day, and there's a wake, and they sort of, the family will come together, and that was immediately not allowed. For the first month, I think it was, like funerals were basically not allowed, not even sort of, I think they eventually started to open up and allowed 3 people from a family to be there. If people had to travel, they weren't allowed to travel. So very devastating effects. But one of the things that has struck me is we have a WhatsApp group with the church, and it's been very interesting as we've shared prayer points. How many folk from the church have talked about family members or neighbours or people they know that are starting to just showing an openness to the gospel that they never showed before? I think that being confronted with death and tragedy and something is creating an openness. And I don't believe for 1 minute the Lord provoked this, but I do believe passionately the Lord can use this. And so again, all your prayers that one, the Lord will stir people's hearts, confront them with their eternity and their need of Him, but also that the church may learn how to take advantage of these opportunities. So really value your prayers for that. Down in the southern region, we were not so badly affected. Actually, the region of Andalusia where we live is a fairly comparable size to Ireland if you take the whole island. It's very slightly larger and has a larger population, but actually has less cases now. The figures I have are a few weeks old, and again, as you know, Spain is starting to it seems they're starting to lose control again of the numbers are going up very rapidly. But as of, I think about 3 weeks ago when I prepared some of the figures, I think in Ireland as a whole, north and south, there had been about 32,000 cases. In Andalusia, we had about 17,000 at that point, so just under half. The worst affected regions were Madrid and also Catalonia. That's where Andrew and Ruth Reed, who some of you will know, they live. And they've been a lot sort of worse affected. And so value prayers for them, but for us as well. So it is ongoing. We're facing an autumn where at the minute we're just not sure what's going to happen. And as I'm sure you face yourselves, it's very hard as churches to know how to plan even. And I think so at the minute we're kind of planning sort of the minimum that's possible. We have started meeting in the building again since end of May. We were allowed to meet. The one advantage I think we have, we're allowed to sing. We haven't been forbidden from singing. We have to have face masks, but we're allowed to sing from behind our masks. And so in a sense, there's a certain normality. It's not completely normal, but there's a certain normality in terms of Sunday service, but of course, very restricted in any other ministries outside of that, particularly with children and young people. That's still not sort of started up again. So value your prayers just even for wisdom, which again, I'm sure you wrestle with here, to know how to be or sort of listen to the authorities and heed advice and in the sense that sort of obedience to the guidelines, but at the same time a boldness and a vision to see the opportunities to share. Perhaps finally, well, I say finally, I'll maybe mention one other thing, and then maybe there's a space, if anybody has a question, either something I've said you want me to sort of clarify, or something I haven't said that you would like to know about ourselves, about our work, or about Spain. I'm always very conscious that in 20, 30 minutes, you can't tell everything and all that's happened, but if there's anybody who would like to ask something, we're very happy to do that. But just finally, I would value prayers as a family. As I said, we've been working with the church now for about 14 years. And we've probably over the past year had a growing sense that our time with the church in Algeciras is drawing to a close. And there have been certain things that happened this year, and I don't need to go into all the details, it'll probably help clarify that. We're not sure exactly all it means at the minute. We've been having different meetings with Mervyn, with the mission committee, and obviously praying. But we just value your prayers for us as a family, for the Lord's direction as to the future. Kind of everything's on the table at the minute. We're looking at possibly staying in Algeciras, but working sort of on a regional level or with some other churches, possibly moving elsewhere in Spain or whatever. There's also a possibility of us maybe coming back for a year sabbatical and just kind of having a bit of distance to return. We do value prayers for much wisdom. As I said, as you know, there's great needs right across Spain. Our heart is very much in that country. Very conscious, particularly of what this will mean for Natalie. So really value prayers for her. Because I think of all of us, basically Algeciras is all she's ever known. And there's questions about her education as to whether she comes back and like Rebecca does A levels or whatever. So just value your prayers for us as a family and for direction from the Lord over these coming months and even over the coming year, that we would know His direction. So, excuse me. Does anybody have a question or anything you'd like to pick up on?